What is the secret to this 25-year friendship between the two of you?
We don't talk every 15 years.
Yeah. We've actually been friends
For about 3 of that.
Yeah.
And then we have, and the rest of the time we don't have to speak.
George Clooney was married Saturday in a star-studded affair in Venice. In case you hadn't heard, he tied the knot with British human rights lawyer Amal.
What if one of Hollywood's most iconic friendships wasn't as unbreakable as the world believed? In this cinematic narrative, 2 names sit at the center of it all: Brad Pitt and George Clooney, friends for over 2 decades, bonded by fame, loyalty, and a shared history inside the most watched industry on Earth. But even the strongest alliances can develop quiet fault lines. A single evening by Lake Como, soft light, calm water, and a conversation that doesn't raise its voice, but changes its weight. One sentence spoken almost casually, that lingers long after the moment has passed. Because in a world where every relationship is performed for the public, the real story is never what's announced. It's what's barely said and never explained. And when you look closer at the bond between Brad Pitt and George Clooney, you start to realize this isn't just a story about friendship. It's about perception, control, and the dangerous space between what we show the world and what we refuse to admit even to ourselves: unbreakable Hollywood brotherhood. To understand why Brad's words carry so much weight, you first need to understand the friendship. Because this is not some casual Hollywood acquaintance where 2 actors exchange pleasantries at premieres and pretend to be close for the cameras. This is something real, and it started in the most unlikely way. The year was 2001, the set of Ocean's 11. Brad Pitt walked in already carrying the reputation of being the most handsome man in the industry, and George Clooney, never one to let an opportunity for a joke slip by, greeted him with a grin and said, "So I hear you're the most handsome guy on set."
Well, Brad Pitt just said recently, someone asked him who did he think is the most good-looking person in the world. He goes, that would be George Clooney.
Brad just shrugged, smiled back, and replied, "Let's see by the end of the day who gets booed more." That was it. That one exchange. It sounds like nothing, right? But sometimes the biggest friendships in your life begin with the smallest moments. And this was theirs. From that day forward, they became inseparable in a way that confused everyone around them. 2 massive egos in an industry designed to pit people against each other, and yet there was no competition between them. Only laughter, only loyalty. Brad once plastered fake "sexiest man alive" posters of George all over Rome just to embarrass him during a press tour. George retaliated by sending a funeral wreath to Brad's trailer with a card that read, "My condolences on the loss of Brad Pitt's looks." At Cannes in 2007, they danced backstage like teenagers who had snuck into a party they were not invited to. Behind the scenes of Burn After Reading, George once shouted across the set, "You are the worst actor I have ever met, but I still don't want to act with anyone else." Everyone laughed, but if you listened carefully, you could hear the truth buried inside the joke. Because beneath the pranks and the one-liners, there was something neither of them talked about publicly. These 2 men, who seemed invincible to the rest of the world, were both carrying fractures that no amount of fame could fix. When Brad's divorce tore through his life in 2016,
and the surprise split. ABC's Matt Gutman on the impending divorce of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie Pitt.
George was the one who showed up at his door without calling first. No advice, no speeches, just presence. And when George found out at 56 years old that he was about to become a father of twins,
no one is more excited about the arrival of the Clooney twins than George's dad, Nick.
the Brad sent him an oversized adult diaper with a note that said, "Get ready, old man, it's your turn to cry." That is how they communicated. Through humor that held pain, through gestures that said what words could not. Brad once admitted that George is the person he calls when everything falls apart, because George does not just see the problem in front of you, he sees the entire chessboard. And George, a man who uses comedy like armor, found in Brad one of the only people on Earth who could see past the performance and recognize the exhaustion underneath. 25 years. No jealousy, no rivalry, no ego wars, just two men who called each other every single week, no matter where in the world their schedules had thrown them. They had survived failed marriages, public scandals, personal collapses that never made the headlines. And through all of it, they held each other up. That is why when Brad finally decided to speak about what he had seen inside George's marriage, it was not out of malice or attention-seeking. It was because he had earned the right to tell this story. He had been there for every chapter, and now he was watching a new one unfold that frightened him. George and Amal's love story. Before the cracks, there was a story the world already knows, but rarely understands in full. George Clooney was not always the man the world associates with marriage, fatherhood, and calm certainty. For decades, he was Hollywood's most famous bachelor, an actor who, after his early marriage to actress Talia Balsam ended in 1993, repeatedly insisted he would never remarry. In interviews across the 2000s, so Clooney often framed commitment as something he admired in others, but did not personally seek. Freedom, for him, was not just preference, it was identity. That identity held firm through high-profile relationships, including with Elisabetta Canales and Stacy Keibler, both of whom experienced intense media attention during their time with him. Yet, as Clooney himself would later acknowledge in interviews, none of those relationships changed his stance on marriage or children. Then came 2013. The turning point is widely known: a visit to Lake Como, where Clooney owned a villa long associated with his private life. It was there he met Amal Clooney, a human rights lawyer with an established international legal career, including work at the International Court of Justice and high-profile advocacy in global human rights cases.
Amal Clooney, the smart, savvy, and stylish lawyer and, yes, wife of George Clooney.
See, what made the connection unusual, according to Clooney in later interviews, was not glamour, but distance from it. Amal was not impressed by Hollywood. She was not drawn into its ecosystem. And for Clooney, that absence of performance became magnetic. He would later describe writing long emails, sometimes late into the night, as if he were suddenly unsure how to behave in his own life. Friends around him noticed the shift, the famously independent man becoming unexpectedly consistent, intentional, even nervous. By 2014, the transformation had become public. Clooney proposed, and the couple married in Venice in a ceremony that drew global attention, with guests including leading figures from entertainment and media. It was one of the most documented celebrity weddings of the decade, not because of spectacle alone, but because of what it symbolized: a man who had long rejected marriage, choosing it willingly. In interviews following the wedding, Clooney often spoke about stability and partnership in ways that contrasted sharply with his earlier public persona. He and Amal later welcomed twins in 2017.
Actor George Clooney and his beautiful wife Amal are the proud parents of twins. A representative for Clooney confirms the babies, a boy and a girl, were born this morning.
An event Clooney humorously described in press appearances as life-altering in the most overwhelming way imaginable. He has frequently credited fatherhood and marriage with reshaping his priorities. In public remarks, he has emphasized teamwork, mutual respect, and the grounding effect of family life, particularly as both he and Amal maintained demanding global careers, from film production to international legal advocacy. They appeared together at major events, including United Nations-related engagements tied to Amal's work, and film premieres tied to Clooney's directing and acting projects. The public image was consistent, a couple balancing high-pressure careers while maintaining a shared private life, largely kept away from controversy. And yet, even in the most stable stories, distance can appear, not as crisis, but as consequence of two lives moving at extraordinary speed. For Brad Pitt, positioned here as a close friend observing from within Hollywood's inner circle, the story is not one of collapse, but of complexity. How two people can deeply commit to each other while still being pulled by time, responsibility, and the relentless structure of global careers. Because sometimes, the most powerful love stories are not defined by what breaks them, but by how long they manage to hold everything together while the world keeps moving. An emotional relationship distance. But here is where the story turns, and I need you to pay close attention, because this part is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is the opposite. It is the kind of quiet erosion that destroys marriages not with a single blow, but with 1,000 paper cuts that no one notices until there is nothing left to save. It started with schedules. Amal was taking on some of the most consequential human rights cases in the world, traveling between Geneva, London, and The Hague. George was still shooting films, still attending premieres, still being pulled into the machinery of an industry that never sleeps. Their homes, Lake Como, London, Los Angeles, Manhattan, which once felt like beautiful escapes, slowly started feeling like reminders that stability was just an illusion they had been telling themselves. They were not fighting. That was the thing Brad noticed first. There were no arguments, no explosive confrontations, no slammed doors. There was just absence. A text reply that came 6 hours late. A missed flight that meant another dinner alone. An evening where they sat side by side on a terrace in Italy and said nothing, not because they were comfortable in the silence, but because neither of them knew what to say anymore. Brad watched it from a distance close enough to understand, but far enough to see what they could not. Amal appeared less and less at Hollywood events. George stopped showing up to her speeches at the United Nations. The dates by the water that used to be filled with laughter became rare, and then stopped entirely. Brad did not need anyone to explain what was happening. And he had lived through the exact same thing in his own marriage. That slow, terrible drift, where two people who love each other simply stop being present in each other's lives. One night in a makeup room, George let his guard down just long enough to murmur, "Maybe I'm slowly losing the most precious thing I've ever had." Brad put his hand on George's shoulder and said quietly, "You haven't lost anything yet, unless you let go yourself." But the distance kept growing. When they were on opposite sides of the globe, it was not just geography separating them anymore. It was the evenings Amal spent alone reviewing case files in a brightly lit room, while George finished shooting at 3 in the morning and realized her missed call was still sitting unanswered on his phone. The questions started forming, unspoken at first, and then impossible to ignore. Why aren't you here? Why didn't you come? When will we actually be together again? And then the media descended, because Hollywood's press corps can smell vulnerability the way a predator smells blood. All it took was Amal turning her face at a single moment on the red carpet, and by morning, the entire industry was buzzing that the marriage was over. Brad sighed when he saw the headlines. "They don't understand," he said. "Sometimes it's just a tired blink, not a sign of the end." One night on a terrace, just the two of them, and a bottle of wine, and the kind of darkness that makes people honest, Brad said something to George that he had been holding for months. Hollywood doesn't kill love. It just makes you forget how to love like a normal person. George was quiet for a long time before he answered. I just don't want to do wrong by her, but I'm not sure anymore that I'm doing it right." And that, Brad realized, was the most painful kind of confession. Not guilt over something done, but terror over something slipping away that you do not know how to hold. Unresolved inner conflict. What follows is not a confirmed account of private lives, but a cinematic reconstruction, an interpretation of moments the public has seen, and the meaning people around them might have read into them when the cameras were off. Because sometimes, the truth of a story in Hollywood is not what is proven, but what is quietly felt in the spaces between what is known. And for Brad Pitt, that space began to feel heavier over time. It was easy to understand how it all started. In 2001, on the set of Ocean's 11, George Clooney and Brad Pitt built a friendship that looked effortless on screen, and even more chaotic off it. Pranks, jokes, and a kind of chemistry that only two secure egos can sustain without turning it into rivalry. That same film introduced the now iconic collaboration with Julia Roberts.
The upcoming rom-com Ticket to Paradise, also, incidentally, the nicest coach seats I've ever seen.
Yeah.
George Clooney, Julia Roberts, back together again.
Whose presence added a different kind of energy entirely. Sharp, intelligent, emotionally grounded. Over the years, that trio crossed paths again in Ocean's 12 Money Monster, 2016, and later Ticket to Paradise, 2022, where Clooney and Roberts played ex-spouses trapped in shared chaos. To the world, it was entertainment. To insiders, it was simply three professionals who trusted each other deeply enough to keep returning to the same creative space. But life outside the frame was changing. By 2013, Clooney's life took a historic turn when he met human rights lawyer Amal Clooney, a moment often described in interviews as unexpected and transformative. Within a year, they married in Venice in 2014.
Details on George Clooney's blockbuster wedding. We're getting our first look this morning at Amal's dress on the cover of People magazine.
In a ceremony that became one of the most photographed celebrity weddings of the decade. In 2017, they welcomed twins, a milestone Clooney himself has publicly described as redefining his identity. From the outside, it looked like a completed arc, the legendary bachelor choosing a different life entirely. But what Brad observed, at least in this fictionalized telling, was not disruption, but drift. Not scandal, not rupture, something quieter. A shift in rhythm. Between international court cases, UN-level human rights work, and global travel for Amal, and Clooney's constant film schedule, and including major projects like Suburbicon and The Midnight Sky, the couple's lives began to operate on parallel timelines. Not broken, just increasingly asynchronous. And into that silence, this narrative suggests, an old familiarity remained constant. Clooney's long-standing friendship with Julia Roberts, a bond shaped by decades of shared sets, press tours, and mutual understanding that began on Ocean's 11. There were public moments that reinforced their closeness, light-hearted interviews, warm red carpet reunions, and their easy emotional rhythm in Money Monster and Ticket to Paradise. Nothing inappropriate, nothing hidden in plain sight, just a rare Hollywood friendship that survived time, fame, and shifting personal lives. But Brad, positioned in this story as observer and confidant, begins to interpret something else. Not romance, but resonance. Not betrayal, but emotional familiarity that sometimes grows so comfortable it becomes hard to distinguish from longing for a simpler version of oneself. A version unburdened by responsibility. A version that does not have to perform strength. One night in Lake Como, long associated with Clooney's private life and family retreats, Brad recalls a moment of reflection. Clooney, exhausted after travel, reportedly looked out over the water and said something that stayed with him, that certain connections in life don't disappear, they just change form. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't directed at anyone specific. But in the logic of storytelling, Brad interpreted it as a window into something deeper, the tension between memory and commitment, between who we were and who we choose to become. The reality, of course, is simpler and far more grounded. Clooney has consistently spoken about love, marriage, and fatherhood as stabilizing forces in his life, and Roberts has remained a close friend and collaborator in a strictly professional sense. But in narratives like this, where emotion is amplified and silence becomes meaning, every glance can become a signal, every pause a story, and so the question lingers, not as fact, but as theme. When a life is built on both deep friendship and deep commitment, how do you tell the difference between what pulls you backward and what simply reminds you of who you used to be? Because in stories like this, nothing ever truly resolves the moment we stop watching. For Brad Pitt and George Clooney, what unfolds next may never be spoken aloud, only lived quietly in the spaces between decisions and consequences. And the world will see premieres, interviews, smiles that look rehearsed enough to be real, but not real enough to be trusted. And somewhere beneath it all, there remains the question no one can answer out loud: whether the most important choices in a man's life are made with certainty or simply with the hope that regret will be survivable. Because in Hollywood, endings are rarely endings. They are pauses, carefully constructed silences before the next act begins. So the only question left is this: when the lights change and the cameras stop pretending to look away,